So we're talking with Susan Suntree, and you have a really eclectic portfolio as a poet, a writer of fascinating archaeological history, combination of synergistic discoveries, and being an activist, an environmentalist for the wetlands in Los Angeles, for preservation of historic buildings. Could you just say a word about what motivated you to do these different interesting things? Why do it and not just play checkers or golf or something?
um, I don't know the answer to that question that I can give you as a naming some very specific reason. I do it because it arises in me the necessity to do it. I feel like if I see an injustice or something that is completely wrong, like the destruction of the wetlands or the destruction of cultural buildings, important trees that should be landmarked and certainly preserved, I feel the need to say something. I'm not afraid to say something. Maybe that's from years of performing and being a professor and so forth. Maybe that's why. I don't mind public speaking. So maybe but I have felt this way since I was a child. I mean, my first act of activism was when I was about 10 and pulled up stakes, developers' stakes. They were going to build on my beloved desert, and I was out riding on my pony, and we just rode around and pulled up stakes and broke them and threw them on the ground to prevent the destruction of the desert, because I love the desert. And so I don't know. I'm not afraid, and a lot of people are. It's not to say that I don't get really nervous, and sometimes I have been afraid, especially confronting the police. I have been really afraid, but I always am with a good team. That's critical.
You have 3 siblings. Are any of them in your mold of caring about injustice? And if not, what was there about your birth order, or is it just something you brought in as part of being Susan?
My older sister has been very much a civic activist and an activist for the environment and animal rights. And my younger sister, Peggy, is now, when she has the time, because she works so much, attends political rallies for the candidates she supports, and whenever she can, and exchanges emails and shares information for progressive causes. And my brother Ted is very conservative, super conservative, the mold that we were raised in, and he did not break the mold. But he spent a little time being civically active in his community, but he works a lot, and he's not an outgoing person, so that shapes his response to community.
Do you think that the girls reacted against their parents' point of view, and it's some kind of generational swing or reaction?
Well, I think so, because both my sisters and I were affected by the 60s and 70s, and Ted not so much. And, our father was very civically active. He was a public speaker. He ran for city council. He was on planning commission. He was the president of civic groups, like the Chamber of Commerce, and that sort of thing. And I think that had, I don't know, I think that I inherited his capacity for public speaking. And he was an actor before he became a businessman. Mm. And so I just think that has to have had something to do with it.
Right.
Although he wasn't so active when he was during certain parts of our lives. Like when I was in high school, he was just busy being a businessman. Mm-hmm. But later on, he became really active again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Was the wetlands in Los Angeles your first major environmental thrust, or were you an activist before that?
I think I've always been an activist, Gail. I mean, my very first act of activism since that moment in the desert was when I got my first position in Modesto, at Modesto Community College, in the English department, and went and joined the strike against Gallo because of their treatment of their workers, the pickers and the farm workers. So that I just joined the line because I was there and I believed in what they were doing, and I had the time, and there were a lot of people there. I was just one among many, but it felt good to do that. And I met great people. You know, one of the things people don't realize about activism is that it's really, a lot of the time, not always, I've been in situations where it's not fun. The people weren't fun. But most of the time, it's really fun. It's enlivening. It's like being in a great party, and everybody encourages everyone else, and you have a surround of joyous, activated, peppy people, and usually a lot of artwork, which has been my contribution. And that's come into it through artwork.
The uprisings led by young people since 2011, everyone who participated, and I felt that in marches for women or for science, there's a kind of euphoria from being with a large group that has a similar purpose. So there's an excitement and a kind of feeling of support that all of us are supporting women's rights, or all of us are supporting the importance of science. And and I don't know, it maybe clicks in the motor neurons where we're all reading each other's emotions, and it enhances it, and it feels good.
It feels so good. And that's what people learn when they do it. And it's the big rallies and the big marches certainly have that. The on the smaller scale, when you're part of a small team, usually it's a handful of people who do all the work, but that's okay, because then there's always an outer circle and a circle beyond that do the work that needs to be done also, and it takes everybody. If you're a grassroots activist, if you're grassroots organizing, it takes everybody, every quarter inch of effort to achieve a grassroots movement to succeed. And so it can be a lot of hard work, sometimes frustrating and disheartening, but one of the things I highly advise people when they ask me about grassroots organizing and activism, I say that you have to have a team. You cannot do it alone. You can't be. I mean, if you have lots of money and you're a lawyer, or you and a lawyer, you with your lots of money and a lawyer are going to do the work, that's a different story. And I don't know that story. I have never been in that circumstance. I have been in multiple grassroots efforts, and the core team is so important. And who's on it? And you have to hang together. Everybody has to persevere and hang together and be mutually supportive. And then you're not alone going forward. You can yell and scream on each other, to each other's ear, and vent. And one of the things that, especially in this recent action to save these historical houses, was how important it was that we had fun. And I highly recommend this. My co-chair of that effort, Diane Miller, really made that her top priority for our meetings. I mean, when we started meeting, and this was a almost 4-year process, so we had a lot of meetings, she would bring a chicken dinner. I mean, we met at happy hour, but she made it a dinner, and people came from after work, and they had dinner, and it was fun. So our goal was to make every meeting as fun as possible, and then we devolved to happy hour when we were right up, when we were getting close to big hearings, and we had to meet every week. But happy hour, it didn't matter if you drank or not. It was about being happy. So food that was tasty, and people always brought food. It was just like it was really important to eat together, and we were very effective. We had to the point, well-organized meetings. We disagreed, we argued, but we all had this. We liked each other, and we were having fun together, and we respected each other, and we resolved to find a common ground for going forward, and we did. So the food and the happy part doesn't mean you have to have a sloppy, disorganized, endlessly long meeting. It holds people around the table. So
I found that when I was helping young people organize in Chico, that you had to have pizza and a band if you wanted people to come.
Right. and I had to have it so I would come, because it was this last effort. Well, all the last few efforts have been really a lot of work against insuperable odds, seemingly insuperable odds. And so you had to keep your happy factor up there, boy, or you just could not go on.
What people usually say about liberal causes is they often end up who's in competitions, who's the most pure, who's the most, has the most ideological purity, and if you're not pure, then you don't belong, and it goes into these schisms and judgments of purity. But have you found that in your grassroots organizing or not?
Well, of course I've heard that argument, but I think that's a red herring. I really do. I think that people have their opinions about what the best course is. And that's, if you want to frame that as purity, you're just asking for trouble and divisiveness. It's people's opinions, and they have their reasons for having them, and that has to be respected. And that needs to be discussed. So I would just can that whole dialogue. I don't think it's useful at all. And I don't think it's accurate. Not in my experience.
When I was involved with the feminist men's movement, they certainly got into that. Who was the most feminist? And there was looked down on people like Warren Farrell, who wasn't sufficiently feminist, and they didn't want him to come to their conference. And so
you're not getting everything done that way. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested. I take up a project because I want to get something done, and that's just one-upmanship that has nothing to do with getting something done. And I do this. It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time away from my writing when I'm doing it, although I do a lot of writing when I'm doing it. So it's not like you're not, for me, not writing or performing. In the case, I've done a lot of performing as part of the educational and a part of activism and attracting the camera's eye, attracting attention, getting people. That's a whole other discussion of the role of art in activism, which I am a total advocate for, and there's not enough of it. But there's more in recent years, so I'm all for that. Bring on the puppets.
Mm-hmm. So it's true. When the media covers a march, they show the posters.
That's right.
They show what a great hit I think is the Trump baby blimp that they have in London. That's a brilliant use of art.
Yeah, there's no way to argue that art isn't probably maybe the most effective. Like the Bayona wetlands, we could not effort. That went on for 10 years. It's still going on, in fact. But our theater troupe was involved in it for 10 full years. And in the early years, it could not get on into the Times. But we started our Earth, Water, Air, LA trek, performance trek across Los Angeles from endangered open space, connecting in endangered open spaces with teach-ins and street theater. And we had these giant puppets, and we walked down the streets. And it was so colorful, we made the front page of the California section in a great big full-color picture.
Of the LA Times.
Of the LA Times. They can't resist it. They just can't resist it. So you've got to have chicken dinners or a happy hour of some sort, and all the art you can bring in, the better, as is appropriate to what you're doing.
Right. We're such a media-oriented culture now that there has to be good visuals, photo
There have,
ops.
that's right. You have to have lots of photos. For example, for creating the historic district, we had lots of photos of the houses. We kept posting them over and over and over and over, posting photos of these houses. As much best beauty shots we could get, and historic photos of the street, and all that sort of thing. So everything we did, almost everything, came along with photos.
Well, let's look at this those two case studies. So why don't we talk a little bit about the historic houses? So most people are not going to know anything about these houses on 11th Street in Santa Monica. Why did you spend 4 years of your life fighting for them? What's the deal with those houses?
Well, these houses are beautifully built demonstrations of the architecture and way of life of the middle and working class people who actually made Santa Monica a hometown. Now, the wealthy people north of Montana, and some of them down by the beach, would build great big mansions. And the Hollywood folks would come and stay and party. But that was the transient culture. The people who came to make it a hometown were on the school board, were on the Chamber of Commerce, were policemen, were teachers, owned the brick factory, owned the nursery, worked at the brick factory. And those types lived in these bungalows. They're mostly, 1,000, 1,200 square feet. And I live in one of them. And they are, the way they orient to the street, their passive solar functions, which were amazingly successful, their relationship to the community, their entire being speaks of a way of life and an attitude toward community. They were the housing for middle-class people. This kind of housing was the beginning of, in some ways, of women's liberation, because the great big bungalows, like the famous Green and Green so-called bungalow in Pasadena, the ones that are the big mansion bungalows, built in craftsman style. They're not bungalows, they're craftsman mansions. They're built with servant quarters. But these homes where people lived with their families, this was when kitchens began to be designed for the housewife, for the woman who lived there and was going to cook the meals. And so I have a huge kitchen, and it's really well designed. And it was these houses, the craftsman bungalows, of the early 20th century that marked the beginning of a house that was well built, well designed, with all kinds of marvelous design features for the middle class person and even working class person. And a woman is going to not have a maid. She's going to cook, and she's going to serve the family. So the dining room is right next to the kitchen. The kitchen is spacious with many cupboards, lots of windows. And so these are the homes of ordinary families, not the wealthy. Mm-hmm. And so there are very, very, very few saved in this community. In fact, the person who was a major character in the civic community lived in one of the houses that we saved, built the house, and lived in it, was on endless boards. It was on the school board for years, making important early decisions about location. The original high school was on the corner, right, kitty corner from our district. This was the easternmost edge of the development of the city, which began down by the beach and then spread this way, and they put the high school there. That site has been a school ever since 1898.
When was your house built?
1911. The oldest house in the block that we saved was built in 1904. So,
why was there necessary for a fight? What did the owners intend to do with those old houses?
Well, the major problem, ironically, was not with owners. Of the 5 conforming bungalows, that means the ones that are in almost pristine condition, which in 108 years, that's pretty, or longer for the 1904 one, and the others are 1906 and so forth. That is astounding. It's a fluke of history that we have this little cluster. And they have two that have been modified, but not so much that you can't tell that they don't really fit in. And then only 3 buildings in this little district that are like built in the 1950s and 60s, or that kind. 2 apartment buildings and 1 condo building. So they really speak of the era. And they're exactly at the spot that marks the developmental phase of the city. And the people who lived in them were all important members of the community. They all participate. Some leaders, some like the guy who was famous who lived in my house. He grew up here. He went to Santa Monica High School. And when he was a genius of electricity and an inventor. And when he was at Santa Monica High School, I think he was 16. He was at the Pacific exhibition, the big World's Fair, and he was called the boy genius for his, at that time when he was at Santa Monica High School and living in this house, and he had a workshop out back for the extraordinary electrical effects, arcing Tesla coils and all kinds of things. When he was living in this house at age 16.
Wow.
He later went on to be one of the founding special effects creators in early Hollywood. He's like created special effects, and in those days, and until very recently, special effects were done live and you filmed them. And he was also an amazing photographer. When he was in high school, he did some of the early photos of Santa Monica, and there's a whole collection of his work in the Santa Monica Library and the Santa Monica Museum.
So what does your the owner of your house, where you've lived for decades, what does she want to do with the house?
It's a family. And well, that's what got this iteration of this effort to create this historic district started. They posted a demolition sign. And of course, they want to build a great big box apartment building of the cheapest possible nature, because it used to be condos, now rentals, because rents are one of the highest in the country here. So that's where the money is. And you got to squeeze as many of those little boxes in there as you can. And that's what they intended to do. So that's what got the whole thing started. And that was 4 years ago, May. And that we had tried 30 years ago, 30 years ago, in 89, 90, 91, there was an incredible neighborhood committee for another bungalow, pristine Queen Anne bungalow where a family lived. But an investor from outside the country came in with cash, bought it from the old owners, and they built a condo. And we tried to save it and create an historic district then, and we lost via a really nasty legal move that happened. And it was most unfortunate. The house came down in the middle of the night. And that really kind of crushed everybody. But it just simmered along until this time. And this time we succeeded.
Why?
Because
what was different?
It's a different time. It's a different community. There's so much. The overdevelopment in Santa Monica is just, the people who live here are many are very unhappy about it. And so the zeitgeist had changed. And community support we had loads of community support then, but it was even more so now. And we had a very savvy committee. We had a great committee then, but we had even more so, I think, this time around.
Where did you find your opposition? Because it certainly was a struggle.
Well, 2 owners who were opposed, my owner, because I rent, and an owner of a bungalow 2 doors down, who were opposed because they wanted to build these big houses, big buildings, apartment buildings. But so that was all, though that's not a majority. And the law had changed that an owner's objection, if the city determines they want a district, the owner's objection did not stop it. So we have the new law. That's the other thing. We had better laws this time around. And so the opposition was from the city, the planning department, because their commitment is to development.
Wow.
And it's 100%. And they moved out of the landmarks arena of the planning department. They moved out the planner who had some background in planning and who was supportive of people, he was willing to attend community meetings and help people understand the law and so forth, as he was, he's the planner assigned by the planning department to the Landmark Commission. They moved the new city manager moved him out and moved in his hand-picked woman, and it seemed as though her mandate was just to say no because they really want development, and they just saw development all down this block. Now they want the money, and for the city, and we had once she came on board, and she has no background in planning, no education whatsoever in planning. I mean, not in planning, in preservation. And preservation planning is like a major in college, But so that's why it was really unfortunate, the kind of shenanigans that were pulled against us. You could even say kind of lying, cheating, and stealing. It was really bad. But we have a savvy, tough committee, smart, tough, persistent. I mean, how we all hung together over all that time. No one thought it would take that long. But then things changed in the city with her arrival and the new city manager, and the fight was on.
And what you won it? Why? How were you able to win against the city?
Well, first of all, my advice to anyone who's doing grassroots activism is that you need to create what I call the embrace, or you could call it the Vise Grip if you want, but let's call it the embrace, or we'll just call it the grip. And one side is the law, because the laws were better for us than they were last time by far. So you've got to know the laws really well of whatever it is you're trying to achieve. Or you've got to have somebody on your team, if it's super complex, like wetlands laws and so forth, very complex. In the case of preservation in Santa Monica, I read them. They're not that many. You can read them, but you have to also be aware when you're researching law, because you have to know the law. The law has to be on your side. Number one, it has to be. And if it isn't, you've got trouble. But you've got to, okay. So we found out that the laws weren't even updated on the website. All the forms weren't there. The forms were inaccurate. The forms were from 10 years ago. It was really an effort. And we got stymied more than once by trying to ascertain what the laws actually are. I consider that, just terrible, by these highly paid people in one of the wealthiest cities in California, that they can't keep their website updated. And I think it's a strategy because it made things really hard. So we paid fees we didn't have to pay. We didn't pay a fee that we were told we didn't have to pay. And then it turns out, oh, but you did have to pay it. So we had to run down and pay it before the meeting. I mean, it was like in every way. So however you do it, you got to know the law. And don't think that what's online is accurate. Okay, that's one, and that takes constant paying attention to. And if you're doing preservation, you need to know cultural preservation. You need to know the laws of your city, but you also need to know the state and federal preservation laws, because they all kind of pile down on one another. And they in our case, they assumed we wouldn't know the national parks standards, but we did. Those are online. You can look those up. It's 9 o'clock. And anyway, so that they can't try to flummox you by citing laws that they think you don't know. Okay, so know the background of the laws. And then the other arm of the grip, of the embrace, is the community. If you're grassroots, you've got to have the community with you. And you've got to have it, depending how hard your struggle is, you have to have it big time. The wetland struggle, the Amundsen Ranch struggle, the LA River struggle. This struggle for this little historic district took a lot. That was sort of one of the things that I did a lot of, was keeping the community on board, getting more groups to sign on, getting top-notch architects to come write us letters. One of them showed up and testified at three different big meetings. You had to get people to show up and wear your sticker. So the community matters, and you want to be sure that you get in your community the influencers in your community. That's really important. Like, if this person speaks, then those people on that board or on the city council, they'll pay attention, because that's somebody they pay attention to. So as many of those people as you can get, all your friends, your family. We got in Santa Monica has neighborhood organizations. We got all but one. We got a handful of other community organizations and boards to write letters for us. We got these 3 absolutely top architects in the field, 2 to write letters and 1 to write a letter, and 4 of them, and 1 to show up at the meetings and testify.
So you were trying to convince the city council? Is that the power decision maker?
The 2 arms that you really must have.
In order to influence, in your case, the city council?
Pardon me?
The decision maker was the city council, is that right?
Ultimately, in Santa Monica, to establish an historic district, it's the city council that makes the decision, because that involves taxes and laws and zoning issues and so forth. The Landmark Commission can declare a landmark, but it can be appealed to the city council, and in that case, the city council is the ultimate arbiter. Like, we lost a decision on a tree that we're trying to landmark, because the city council upheld the appeal of the developer. Mm-hmm. There are development in the city, and we were fortunate. I mean, it's the zeitgeist, it's twists of the political current. They're always counting votes, so that's why you need influencers to be there to testify.
What about letters to the editors and editorial comments?
We did that. The whole thing got kicked off by an article I had in the local paper, The Argonaut, that I wrote. And they devoted a lot of space to, and then they had 2 weeks full of letters. And of course, I sent it to everybody I know, and people wrote and asked them to write, and they did. But local people wrote too, because the zeitgeist is like, wait a minute, this overdevelopment is killing this city. The traffic is horrible, the looks are awful, and so it's the time now to save things, to save the environment, to save the urban forest, to save cultural. We lost the tree, and wetlands are still threatened, and so forth and so on. It's ongoing, but that's what it takes.
Since Trump was elected, women have been a lot of the grassroots organizers. They're the ones that you see in Congress really interrogating the sleazy politicians. They really go for it, very outspoken and clever. Did you find that women were your vanguard of your organizing, or was it equal?
We had more women than men, but the men were really great. And, there was a man in our central committee. Committees are always in layers. And our central committee, the 4 or 5 people who did everything, but not everything. You can't do everything, but did the core work. I was an architect and on the planning commission, amazing, wonderful man. And then there were 3 women. And then we had 2 other men who were, there were other men who were involved. Another architect, a computer guy, someone. We were sponsored by and supported by our local neighborhood organization for this area, Mid-City Neighbors, and their leadership, particularly one guy and 2 or 3 women, were at the core of it. I've noticed in Southern California, most environmental work, most of it, not all, but most of it is led by women. Yeah, women were a big part of this, of every effort I've been involved in that's been activist.
It's true of the youth-led environmental climate change recent movement in the U.S. They're led by women. And the groups in Europe as well, kind of sparked by Greta Thunberg in Sweden. Mm-hmm. So there's something interesting going on in terms of women being angry and we're not going to take it anymore, kind of a thing.
Well, also being leaders, being willing to be seen and be heard. I mean, most people are afraid to speak up, men and women, and they're just afraid. And I know that. Like, it's fascinating how the whole thing works. Like, someone I know would know socially. It's just another person, another woman, just another guy, and then suddenly they're up on the dais with the microphone in front of their face, and they're the city council person, and my mouth goes dry and my heart pounds. I mean, it's just, and I watch that and I go, that's so interesting. But it's built into us, a certain fear, I think. I got used to it more and more, so it didn't happen quite so often. But nevertheless, there is that factor. And for most people, they hate public speaking. It's the most common fear in America. Mm-hmm. But so that's a big part of it but mostly we just needed people to show up. And a lot of people did. We had great public support. I mean, I'm just so grateful. But to actively take a role, to take a leadership position, to do something is fearful. It really is. And I understand that. But finally, you just have to, as they used to say, feel the beer and do it anyway. You just have to do it. And then
when I was doing organizing for family support systems in Chico, a criticism that I got is that I gave them too much information to try to make the point that they wanted, like one page that they could read quickly. Did you find that? And the same maybe in speaking, that you would get to the point?
Well, when you speak at these commission hearings, you have 3 minutes, sometimes 2. So our job was to get all of our talking points together and then divide them up. And sometimes get people to give a minute for key people who had to make the larger point. I was always the one who wanted to write too much because I knew so much, because I was, I did almost all I did a good portion of the research or the writing up of the research. So I just knew a lot. And it's all very interesting to me. But fortunately, my co-chair was 1 page, they'll never read it. And then I learned from other members of our committee who are very much involved in the city and city functioning and city politics, and I observed it for myself. We would go to these hearings, and they hadn't read anything. It was like, well, then why are you on the board if you're not going to read anything and make decisions that are affecting the whole future of the city? I don't know, it was very frustrating. So I learned the value of 1 page, and I got better. And so we edited each other. We listened to each other. And thank goodness for my co-chair, Diane Miller. She was really good at that. And of cutting it down, making sure, what any of us did was short and to the point.
What organizers are emphasizing today, like in the Obama Foundation that works with youth or Sunrise Movement, they all say, tell a story, tell a personal story, tell a personal story. Why do you think that's such an important part of organizing?
Telling a story is, I believe, endemic to the human being. People have told stories and sung songs that are often stories since bipedalism, maybe before. I mean, birds and everybody tells stories. But human beings, because we're human beings, so that's what we got to deal with. We're just captured by story. We're captured by metaphor, but especially by story. And so, since I knew the story, Mario would always say, okay, I had to tell the story of the people who lived in the houses because I knew those stories. And I was happy to take on that, that function because it was fun to tell those stories. And then Diane, when her speech, she would always say that the story, open with the story of how she fell in love with the bungalows. And that's why she decided to take on this project, because she had done many other things in the city. And so those were always very moving. You had to have the facts. It's like story to lead to open up the way to get to a fact, to lay it down. So you move between reason and emotion, reason and emotion, reason and imagination. And that's why art is so important, because like when we were doing Frogworks, our political street theater, and to save the Bayona wetlands, we took all the facts and wove them into this crazy wild play. And that people would pay attention to that, because it didn't enter them intellectually. It entered their imaginative body and emotional body, and then it could go upstairs to their intellect. My theory of that, of street theater, is you got to say it 3 times, just like the Greeks. You say what you want to say, and then you say it again twice in the story, and then you end with a flyer summarizing it. And this is what you can do. You always tell them what they need to do. And we did that too. For example, with the wetlands. With the historic district, we always stated over and over, this is the picture of what we want. This is what we want. This is what we need. This is what you can do. And if people can picture it, then it can become a reality. You have to have an inspiring vision that you can tell in a story-like fashion for people to picture. And when it has a greater chance of becoming a reality, because it's kind of already born. It's born in their minds in the story. And that's the path to realizing something.
It's like the candidates for office tell their personal story. I was born in the Midwest, of working class parents, and I only was able to go to college because of da-da-da. So that seems to be a widely used strategy. I'm going to tell my story. Right, it's important. But you also have to tell the story in a way that moves your point forward. Because you're always, like in a novel, everything is to move the plot. Reveal the character and move the plot. That's the action of the character. So it's all utility. And so your story has to move toward what you want. It's not just random emoting. That doesn't do any good. In fact, it's defeating. It makes you look pointless. I just read something about some women candidates made a point of breastfeeding or holding their baby during their ads, and it wasn't clear what's the point. I'm a woman, I'm a mother, but it didn't work because the story, the image wasn't tied to a concrete result that is interesting or important for me. Well, that's part of being savvy in your marketing, in your presentation of your vision. It all has to fit together. That would be like, you'd edit that if it were in a story, because it didn't have anything to do with what the heroine was doing, or you make it, if you're doing that, for example, you're breastfeeding in your press conference, there must be you need to be very conscious of why you're doing that. What is it you're trying to say? Because that's a big statement. Yeah. So we tried to be, with all our visuals and all of our research and the fact base, here's the law, this is how we meet it, but it had to always be buttressed with story. Fortunately for our little neighborhood, we had a lot of great stories. And that's really one of the reasons why I think we succeeded, because we did have the stories. These people were interesting. They did contribute. And we did so much research. So many people did so much research, and wrote it up into this big report with photos and charts. And so it's you got law and the facts on one hand, and you got the community and the story on the other. That's the Vise Grip. It's hard to it's hard to resist, because you can rebut, because you've got the facts and the law, and you've got the emotion over here going, we want this. An issue that I think organizers face is long, tedious meetings that eat up time because some people are talking a lot and things get lost in the dialogue of I think this, oh, but I don't agree with you. So my question is, how did you organize your Central Core meetings so that they didn't extend forever? And did you need to rein people in when they got talking on a tangent, or how did you organize the meetings?
Well, this was our group. Our core group had 4 or 5 people, 4 people often, that attended almost every meeting. 4 or 5 people. And then we had the larger group. We would have a bigger meeting when we're getting ready for an action, like getting ready for a hearing. Then everybody, more people would come. That's sort of the circle around that circle. We really try to get everybody here. For our meetings, we always had an agenda, even if it was an informal agenda, but I would always write it up because I can't stand meetings that don't achieve anything. I just can't stand it.
Right.
So for my own sanity, I would write an agenda. Now, I would insist on sticking to the agenda when some of our committee members would wander all over the place. But I took it upon myself to draw people back to the agenda. But you had to allow wiggle room because it's people. And everybody, because this group was a really professional group, and everybody was very busy, and everybody wanted to have a good time, and they didn't want it to waste their time, and they didn't want to stay too long. And so there was this common, in this small group, common motivation. And we just had a really functional situation. I have to say, I'm so proud of everybody, inner group, outer group, larger group than that contributed. They were just like ready to work, ready to listen, ready to get at it. And, some of us argued, and my co-chair and I are very different personalities and see things differently, but both of our views were really necessary, and we both knew that.
Mm.
And then, we had this, everybody would listen, and then we'd come to a decision and just go forward. You just, because you wanted to go forward. Now, I've been in a much larger group where things get more dicey the larger the group. And for example, in the wetlands issue, I was aligned with a small group, and it was just we had a leader. She was brilliant. She is brilliant, and she's pretty independent in her functioning, but she needs people to help her. And I almost always agreed with her, so I was glad to help. But then this group that I was a part of belonged to a coalition of groups. And there were other groups working on this project too. There was a lot of ego involved. It became very dysfunctional. We even had mediation. It was really an unfortunate situation.
This is regarding preserving the wetlands?
Yeah, that went on for many, many years. It was long on before I even got involved. And so there were a lot of territories already staked out. And people, many times people who join nonprofit volunteer organizations don't really have a life. They haven't succeeded in the world, and this is their whole world, and they want the credit for what you did and what everybody did, they did, or their group did that they started. It can get really nasty. And the only way I did not enjoy that so much, but I stuck with my group, what I felt was spot on. The analysis was very good, and that's where I felt my allegiance was, and I still feel that way. But I remember in the heat of just really trying to get this coalition to come together and not pull it against each other and make deals behind everybody's back and so forth. And that goes on. My God, it could be just awful.
It's like primate, chimpanzee bands have those kind of coalitions, and this one's gathers around this alpha male and this alpha female, and it's very primate, it seems to me.
I think it's primate and some groups of primates, but I'm all for the bonobos. They just love sex and get on with it, sex and food, and they're peaceful. I mean, it's chimpanzees you have to worry about. The great apes aren't like that, and the bonobos are not like that. And our closest relative is the bonobo. So I'm going with that tribe. But I remember in the heat of it, I was teaching American literature at one point during that time, and the anti-slavery folks, oh my God, they fought bitterly with one another, and famous people that we know quit because they just couldn't take it anymore. It was so awful. And yet, it plowed along. And so that gave me some solace that this is not the first time ever that an activist group has suffered.
No, I think it's more typical.
Competition. Yeah, we were very lucky. But this is a smaller group. They're people who knew each other. They'd worked together before. We had a common cause, and we liked each other. And we kept it fun, and we kept it well organized. We were really pretty tight. We were just really pretty tight. And that's very fortunate. It's not always like that. Egos get in the way, and you can't do that. And this is men and women. The ego problem. Believe me, in the wetlands part, it's more women than men. Although men were in there slogging, but my gender politics has really shifted. I don't view genitalia as a quality that is worth much. It's policy that matters. And in all the efforts that I've been involved in, it's really your policy. What do you want to do and how are you going to do it that matters? I mean, and if you can't treat other people with respect, then that's not going to work. I mean, things fall apart. Although some people are willing to step, men and women, step on toes and move themselves forward. And we see that in many of our politicians today. I mean, they're the ones who step the hardest on people's toes.
Right.
So I don't have, it's just something that comes with the territory, and you have to learn to navigate it. Other groups are more functional, some are less functional that I've been involved in. I mean, I was involved in a couple of other, over the years I've been involved in other activist activities, and it varies.
Could you say a word about your book, Sacred Sites, for people who are listening? What's that about?
It's the title of the book is Sacred Sites: The Secret History of Southern California. It came out in 2010, fall of 2010, from University of Nebraska Press, and it won a collection of awards. And what it is it's an epic poem. I call it, it's a song cycle. Someday somebody's going to make it into an opera. And it tells it's the book that I wanted to read. And it began as a series of performances, and it ultimately became a one-woman show, and that had some funding and so forth, and that I performed internationally. And then people kept saying this should be a book, because there is no book about the origins of the Southern California landscape and the arrival of the indigenous people and their culture. You have to dig and dig to find these things. So I wrote the book I wanted to read. So one day, it was burning a hole in my file cabinet in those days, and I just said, do it or don't do it. So I said, I'm going to do it. And so from the performances, it became a book. So it tells the story of the origins of the Southern California landscape from the Big Bang to the present. In book one, it's the Western scientific narrative. And then 15,000 years ago, it transitions, and this is just as the Ice Age, the previous Ice Age is ending, when the indigenous people arrive. And the second book and so the first book is attempting to answer the question, how did things come to be the way they are? Why are the mountain ranges running east and west? Very rare on this planet. Mostly they run north and south. Why is there a big basin here? The Southern California is basically this kind of weird basin. Why are there so many earthquakes? What about this weather? And so forth. How did things come to be the way they are? And so the second book, as it transits, with the arrival of the people, is their way in their myths and songs for answering the same question, because everybody asks that question and has to have some answers. So it's a collection of the myths and songs of the indigenous peoples of Southern California, from the Southern Chumash through the Cahuilla, the basic outlines of what people think of as Southern California, and how do things come to be the way they are, the origin of the universe, the origin of the earth. We have a flood myth, and how that's in the myths of Southern California. And then a lot of cultural practices are woven into that, because you can't understand the stories if you don't understand something about the culture. So I wove that in. And then it comes all the way up to the present and ends with Raven and Coyote sitting up by the Hollywood sign, looking down on all those lights. And they have a little conversation about that.
The amount of research and work and interviewing that you did for that book is just phenomenal.
Thank you. Well, it's coming out in paperback next year.
Oh, wonderful.
10-year anniversary, and the press chose it, and I was very honored to bring out in paperback, because they said it's a kind of classic and they want more people to read it. And they did this beautiful job. It's a beautiful book. You get maps and photographs and all kinds of material along with the text itself. Do
you have a book nearby so you can show us at least the cover?
Yeah, I'm going to dip down and pull out a book.
Great.
So next year, it'll also be out in audiobook. I'm producing an audiobook.
Sacred Sites is sacred. Can you show us a picture inside? One of your favorites?
Well, I think one that will look, what I'll do is I'll show you one that I think will translate on I think this one might. This is a petroglyph. Does that come through on the screen?
Yes. Move it a little bit to your left. Tell us about that. What is that?
This is a petroglyph, just a little clip of a 12-foot mural that's in a cave in the Simi Hills, which is one of the northern boundary of the San Fernando Valley. And it's in a sandstone cave, and there's a notch, and it's on a property in the Simi Hills that some people thought was a shaman's training camp. There was a village there, but there are multiple ritual sites there. And there's also in the book the photo of the summer solstice site, and this is the winter solstice site. So this 8-foot mural is polychrome painted, polished, pecked, and it has a keyhole, and the light at the winter solstice goes in, and it's at one end there's a target, and it's really the rings of the simultaneous world, because in this world we're in the middle realm, and that's the realm of forms. And then there are multiple energetic realms, and all of them are happening simultaneously, and they are penetratable. And the shaman are the ones who are trained to make the journey without dying, because it's very dangerous to do this, into these other realms, generally speaking, to find out about the future, but especially to heal people. What's wrong with this person? They go to get information and to bring the right knowledge of the right remedy back to heal people. That's the basic function of the shaman. The shaman's journey is they're doctors. They're called the doctors. And they're the intellects and the doctors, the intellectuals and the doctors of their village. So this shows a Katumet pole, and it is the chained image that's going up the middle. Can you see that?
Yes.
And that's what's called thought by people who've interpreted. Of course, it's very old and nobody knows. It's thought to be a pole that was often placed in the northern Tongva regions and in the southern Chumash regions when someone important died, or anybody that had any standing. They put up a pole with upside down baskets as a burial marker, a ceremonial burial marker. And of course, shamans, the way it's like life and death. They leave their bodies behind, and then they fly. And they fly So it's a living death, and they fly up the death pole, up the Katumet pole, into the nether reaches, into the ethers, these other realms. You can also see a comet, which is often associated with the spirit of important people, powerful people. They were also considered really important omens. And then that character that's flying up. So this mural has been interpreted as being this section of the mural has been interpreted as the shaman's graduation, where the shaman flies up, the shaman apprentice flies up with Coyote, and that's Coyote, I think. Coyote's flying up. And if you look over here, you can see a little character right where you can hardly see it right there. That's the apprentice, and a little caterpillar. And so they go up, and then there's another pole where their Coyote is headed face down, and he suddenly they lose their grip, and Coyote crashes all, but this is planned. Coyote crashes into the ground and becomes a pile of bones. But there's another, it's not in here, a gorgeous eagle painting. An eagle comes out and swoops up the little caterpillar and places him on the ground, or her on the ground, to survive. And then the final task of the apprentice, to prove that they knew what they were doing, is to resurrect Coyote from his bones. And then, okay, you've got the power.
Huh. That's so interesting, because shamans all over the world had similar duties and went to the underworld or the upper world. So do you think that was because there's like a Jungian archetypal collective unconscious, or is it because they shared common roots that they just carried with them as they migrated?
Well, nobody knows the answer to that. I mean, there's the psychological interpretation, which is the Jungian interpretation. And then there's shamanism is the oldest religion in the world. All religions are derived from it. I mean, think of Jesus going into the underworld and then resurrecting. I mean, a Dionysus going to the underworld and resurrecting, Osiris going into the underworld and resurrecting, and multiple North and South American, Asian, and so forth. It's the background of all world religions. And then some cultures have maintained their shamanic practices. They're always inflected to the individual culture and the individual landscape, because they're very much akin, part and parcel. The energies come from the spirits of place. And so they're always somewhat different, but these foundational views are maintained in shamanic cultures.
So when you went to Mongolia, were some of the practices familiar to you from what you'd studied from Southern California?
Yeah, and I've studied shamanism for years and participated in rituals and so forth for decades. So it was very recognizable. And, Tibetan Buddhism still uses shamans. The Dalai Lama consults a shaman. I've seen a video of it. I mean, and he says it's another way of knowing. That's what somebody asked him, but what? And he said, look, it's another way of knowing. It's another way of, and so he was just fine with it. He didn't make any bones about it. And so, yes, it was very evident there.
I have a monthly radio show on KZFR, and I did one on Native American people who live locally, indigenous people, and they were adamant that they do not believe their origins were coming over the Bering Strait and migrating. They think they came from here. And I wondered if that's true in Southern California, or do they have stories of coming from other places?
I found in the origin myths that I read and consulted with people about, I found a couple of different strains of origin. Amongst the Tongva, which is an Uto-Aztecan, they belong to the Uto-Aztecan family of languages, which is the largest in North America, and it includes the Hopi, for example, and the Aztecs, and the Paiute. They have an origin story about the universe. And they have embedded in their stories are migration from the north. And the people, there's migration is woven into their origin story, which is in the book. But the Chumash, on the other hand, don't deal with the origin of the universe. They just say, well, here it is. Let's deal with it. And they're a different culture, and they're possibly one of the oldest cultures in North America. Genetically, that's some people who are researching them claim, and they have their own they're not a part of another language family, which people thought for a long time, but about 10 years ago or something around that time, they realized that no, this is its own language family. So the Chumash have been here. They could have been amongst, one theory is that they're among the people that came down the coast in boats from the Bering Peninsula, across they call it a land bridge, but I've been there. It's like the size of a country. I don't know why they call it. I always had the wrong impression.
Yeah.
I thought this little skinny trail of land. No, you wouldn't know you were on a land bridge. It's the size of a country when it was above water. So they came down, the theory, they're just a brand new article that I just read about following the genetics from Siberia and 3 different pulses and going back and coming back, and the original people dying out, and then there's even the part of it, the possibility of people from Europe, and why not, because it was all connected. So it's a mishmash, but there's still the consideration that the Chumash came in boats, landed, it was during the Ice Age, and one of the oldest bodies ever found in North America, and maybe still the oldest body, was found, it's a man who's found on one of the Channel Islands. Because remember, they came when the sea level was far out to sea. I mean, it was far, the land was far, a quarter mile out from where it is now. The coastline was totally different. The Channel Islands were one big island called Santa Rosea. It was only a few miles. That's how the mammoths swam across to Santa Rosea and then got trapped there and became pygmy mammoths. I mean, the people were here when there were dire wolves and saber-toothed tigers and mammoths. I mean, think of it.
Wow.
Pretty cool, huh?
Scary.
And they've been here ever since.
Yeah. I saw something on a documentary that the bodies they found of those early people were really beat up. There were broken bones and scars, and because life was hard.
No, I've never heard that. Where did you hear that? There are graves where people have been in wars and have been attacked, and that's where you generally find that kind of thing. But people were buried, and this guy was buried in a flex position with all kinds of stuff, around him. I mean, it's not, that seems inaccurate.
Okay.
From everything I've read. Those are usually war graves. Or they're from the missions, or the white people killing them and then dumping them in graves.
If people want to read your poetry, how would they find your poetry, your other poetry books?
Well, if you go on, I dread to say Amazon or Barnes & Noble, you can find the ones that are still in print, and you can go on my website and see my list of books.
What's your website title?
SusanSuntree.com. It's not entirely up to date, but I'm getting it up to date, and you can write to me at ssuntree@verizon.net. So I'm easily available, and I could sign and send you a book, or so some of the poetry books, some are out of print. Some I have the final copies of from small presses. So I'm happy to do that. And I'm hoping to get a new book out this year, just waiting to hear. And there'll be more to come.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I really appreciate sharing your information, and we're going to make change.